on there for her to film.
This is an NBC News special report. The second impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump. Here's Lester Holt.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're coming on the air with live coverage of the impeachment trial, the Senate trial of Donald J. Trump. And now, after hearing closing arguments from both sides, the senators are about to vote. The question before them: to convict or acquit former President Trump for inciting an insurrection, the violent and deadly assault on the Capitol on January 6, 38 days ago. The House, as you know, voted to impeach then President Trump a week later, and the trial has been underway for the past 5 days. Now, for an unprecedented second time, Trump facing the judgment of the Senate. Casey Hunt has been following it all on Capitol Hill. But first, let's quickly listen in to see if the roll call has actually begun.
President Trump's conduct on January 6, 2021.
All right, they're still reading the actual article of impeachment. So, Casey, it's been a wild day, one that we thought for a time this would be extended into another week, but things have moved very quickly.
That's right, Lester. We finally got to closing arguments late this afternoon after a day of missteps and confusion, stemming from a request at the very start of the day from the House managers to call witnesses. They specifically wanted to talk to Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler. She's a Republican from Washington State who voted to impeach President Trump. And she had put out a statement late last night saying that she was confirming details of a conference call, or excuse me, not a conference call, a phone call that transpired between Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, and then President Trump on the day of January 6th, where President Trump seemed to acknowledge that he knew just how much danger members of Congress were in. She also called on what she called patriots to, if there were anyone who had corroborating or additional information, to come forward now. So they asked the House managers to bring her as a witness, to depose her, and it sent the trial into a much confusion. Neither side was really prepared for what happened, and they quickly went behind closed doors to try and figure out how to move forward. Ultimately, they came to an agreement. Witnesses, even though the Senate had voted, there were enough votes to call witnesses, they decided in the end that that would simply be too arduous. They came to an agreement among themselves, and they backed off. And now here we are with this vote about to begin. Of course, just over a month after this very chamber was overtaken by rioters.
When his or her name is called, will stay in his or her place, and they'll vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules of Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that, quote, no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present, close quote. The question is on the article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent Donald John Trump guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Guilty. Mr. Burr, guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey.
Guilty.
Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy.
Guilty.
Mr. Cassidy, guilty. Ms. Collins.
Guilty.
Ms. Collins, guilty. Mr. Coons.
Guilty.
Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn.
Not guilty.
Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto.
Guilty.
Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton.
Not guilty.
Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz.
Not guilty.
Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines.
Not guilty.
Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley.
Not guilty.
Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty.
Not guilty.
Mr. Haggerty, not guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley.
Not guilty.
Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly.
Guilty.
Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar.
Guilty.
Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy.
Guilty.
Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mr. Lujan.
Guilty.
Mr. Lujan, guilty. Ms. Lummis.
Not guilty.
Ms. Lummis, not guilty. Mr. Manchin.
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey.
Guilty.
Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. Marshall.
Not guilty.
Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell.
Not guilty.
Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Mr. Menendez.
Guilty.
Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley.
Guilty.
Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, guilty. Mr. Murphy.
Guilty.
Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla.
Guilty.
Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters.
Guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed.
Guilty.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch.
Not guilty.
Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney.
Guilty.
Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen.
Guilty.
Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds.
Not guilty.
Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio.
Not guilty.
Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders.
Guilty.
Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass.
Guilty.
Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr. Schatz.
Guilty.
Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer.
Guilty.
Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida.
Not guilty.
Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina.
Not guilty.
Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby.
Not guilty.
Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema.
Guilty.
Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith.
Guilty.
Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow.
Guilty.
Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan.
Not guilty.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey.
Guilty.
Mr. Toomey, guilty. Mr. Tuberville.
Not guilty.
Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen.
Guilty.
Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner.
Guilty.
Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock.
Guilty.
Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren.
Guilty.
Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse.
Guilty.
Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young.
Not guilty.
Mr. Young, not guilty.
Okay, the vote unofficial right now, 57-43, 7 Republicans voting guilty. But it appears that the measure will fall short again, keeping in mind the requirement of 2/3 of those present.
The yeas are 57. The nays are 43.
Yep. The yeas are 57. The nays are 43. 2/3 of the senators present not having voted guilty. The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, upon one article of impeachment exhibited against him by the House Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I send an order to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Ordered. that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials.
All right, again, the vote 57-43, 57 guilty, 43 not guilty, but again, failing to make that two-thirds bar. And so Donald J. Trump is acquitted of the accusation that he incited the riot, the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. Let me bring in our NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. Chuck, not an unexpected outcome. How will those 7 Republican votes, though, that cited guilty, how will that be seen in the totality of this?
Well, look, there's one way to look at it, Lester, and it's not perfectly analogous, but if you look at the Republican Party of today and you do any poll, it is approximately somewhere between 15 and 20% that are not for Trump. And so in this case, you had 14% of the Republican senators vote to convict. So it's, you know, some of them come from states that are very pro-Trump, like Mr. Cassidy of Louisiana. So it's not a perfect comparison, but in the grand scheme of things, in many ways, it is reflective of where the party is, which is a lion's share of the Republican Party is decided to stick with the former president on this issue. I'm sure we're going to hear Republican senators are going to fall into 3 camps, right? We have the 7 that we know voted to convict, and they're going to have very, I think, clear rationales for why they did that. You're going to have some, like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, who were very much with the president the whole time, will be very comfortable in their defense of that vote. But you're going to have, and it'll be very interesting how many attempt to go on the record and essentially have it both ways and say, similar to what Mitch McConnell telegraphed earlier today, which is he doesn't believe the Senate was the proper jurisdiction, but he didn't exactly endorse the president's behavior, and he seemed to imply, and we'll see what more he has to say in a few minutes, seemed to imply that under some circumstances he might have voted to convict. So you'll have some number of Republicans that fall into that camp. But the bigger picture here, Lester, is has the Republican Party, whether this was their intention or not, and have Republican senators here, by not doing enough to convict, whether it was their intention or not, essentially given a permission slip to elevate what is acceptable violence in American politics. And some people may not like hearing me put it in those terms, but that is the slippery slope that some may have to address at some point.
A person we have not heard from throughout all this is Donald Trump himself. That apparently has changed. Let's go to Chief White House Correspondent Kristen Welker. Kristen, what are you hearing?
Well, Lester, we just got a statement from former President Trump. Let me read you some key portions of the statement, and then we can do some analysis on the other side. He says, this has been yet another phase of the greatest witch hunt in the history of our country. No president has ever gone through anything like it, and it continues because our opponents cannot forget the almost 75 million people, the highest number ever for a sitting president who voted for us just a few short months ago. I also want to convey my gratitude to the millions of decent, hardworking, law-abiding, God and country-loving citizens who have bravely supported these important principles in these very difficult and challenging times. Then, Lester, this is a very interesting portion. He says, our historic, patriotic, and beautiful movement to make America great again has only just begun. In the months ahead, I have much to share with you, and I look forward to continuing our incredible journey together to achieve American greatness for all of our people. This has never been anything like it. Why is that so significant, Lester? Because, of course, when former President Trump left office, there was a lot of speculation about whether he would announce another run for office. Now, in the wake of the attack against the Capitol, some of his own allies, some former White House officials have said that any hopes for a political future are over, are done with. But the polls tell a very different story. He's still very popular within the Republican Party, and those who are still working with him and still close to him say he absolutely has a viable political future, but not giving specific details, Lester, about what he plans to do. And I think you have to take a step back and ask questions about the Republican Party writ large. What we saw there in that vote, Lester, is that there are some cracks that have formed in the wake of this. So who will be the leaders of this party moving forward? It is worth noting that the former president's UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, has broken with her former boss. She has her eye on a potential 2024 run, and she has said he's just fallen too far to ever run again for office, Lester.
All right, Krista, thanks. Let's give Andrea Mitchell a bite at that apple. She's our chief Washington correspondent. So this obviously allows some political viability for Donald Trump. Some of the people who just supported his acquittal in that room might have their own eyes on the White House. Are they now frozen in place, waiting to see what he does?
Well, that is a great question for, Ted Cruz, for Josh Hawley, for others with presidential ambitions. But we just also heard from Richard Burr, who was one of the more surprising Republicans who joined the 7 who stood against the president. He said he started this believing it was not constitutional, but once the Senate voted that it was, since the Senate had jurisdiction, as the Democrats have argued throughout, that the Senate sets the rules. And so this is not a court of law, it's a court of the Senate. And that under those rules, then he had to look at the evidence. And the evidence was clear to Senator Burr, who is retiring. He's not running for re-election. He was the head of the Intelligence Committee. But and looking at the evidence, he said the president clearly incited the riot and was guilty as charged. Also interesting, of course, were the emotional closing arguments, especially from Jamie Raskin, who had raised the questions at the beginning of the closing statements, which were, if he was not responsible for this, who was? Why didn't he stop it if he didn't want to cheer it on? And then closed it again, speaking of his children and speaking of his daughter, who had sympathy last night in their family conversations, having lost her brother, of course, tragically, just a few weeks ago, had sympathy for the children of the insurrectionists who, when their fathers left for the rally, were afraid that they would not survive that rally, that they also faced the possibility of losing someone to this terrible division in our society. Lester.
All right, Andrea, thank you. In the time we have left, let me bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. Your thoughts now that the former president has been acquitted?
Donald Trump, Lester, this afternoon is echoing the same grievances that he made during his first impeachment trial, describing it as a witch hunt. And while he is previewing that his political future may yet still hold another twist and turn, there are those sources that I've talked to in the Trump orbit who think this is somebody who may not ever run again, may talk about it frequently for the next 2 to 3 years, but there is still the question of what happens when the rubber meets the road. The bottom line, Lester, with 7 Republicans voting to convict Donald Trump today, this is now the most bipartisan impeachment in modern history, despite the acquittal. Lester?
Lots of twists and turns here, but again, the closing arguments coming rather quickly late this afternoon, and then that dramatic vote. And so for an unprecedented second time, Donald Trump has been acquitted by the Senate after having been impeached by the House. The vote today, 57 to 43, a majority, including 7 Republicans, but short of the 2/3 majority required to convict. We'll have full details coming up on NBC Nightly News. For now, I'm Lester Holt in New York. Good day, everyone.